Welcome to this discussion on Enviromedics, the impact of climate change on human health, written by Doctors Jay Lemary and Paul Auerbach. I'm going to be taking you through some of the more important quotes, or quotes that I found important from the foreword, Chapter 1, a preamble, a doctor's approach, um, and Chapter 2, Climate Change 101. So starting with the forward, I really enjoyed the anecdotal um, feel to it, even though I was going through some really important events throughout history, specifically about how different environmental issues have caused massive movements in terms of population health. Specifically, two examples he discussed were um, the elimination of yellow fever from Havana after the discovery of mosquitoes as being the disease-bearing vectors for yellow fever, dengue, malaria, chikungunya, and other diseases. Um, and then how that was later also implemented in Panama during the Panama construction of the Panama Canal. And that was, that really, because I mean, even when we studied the construction of the Panama Canal in the earlier history classes, there always comes up this uh, notion of how difficult it was to deal with the environmental conditions there, and how because of that it had failed numerous times, and it was such a impossible task. It was deemed to be such an impossible task by the rest of the world, and how a discovery in the medical field led to a major infrastructural development, and I thought that was really interesting. Um, But to wrap this up, he basically, Harvey Feinberg, the writer of this forward, um, basically talks about a few things that he thinks need to be, emphasized when it comes to environmental impact on human health. And he states it in this quote here: the direct stress of heat, impact on food production, damage from extreme weather events, and extension of disease-bearing vectors are among the potential consequences for human health related to global warming. And that's what I believe, that is what the authors of this book are intending to explore more thoroughly, are these 4 or 5 pointers here. But additionally, at the end, he also notes that this book articulates a new stage of development for the field of environmental health that takes account of an unprecedented degree of environmental change caused by humans and the consequences for human health. And I think that's really important as well, because later the author suggests that the book is more geared towards the general public, but um, this also makes it feel as if there is an academic obligation to reading this, especially if you are someone involved in you know research in terms of environmental impact, or like water policy, or climate science, anything like that. It's important then for you to consider this book in that light, and I thought that was really an interesting um, thing to add there at the end of his foreword. So chapter 1 is called Preamble, the Doctor's Approach, and it has a subtitle that says Any Emergency Department in America. And right off the bat, I thought that was really interesting, because for the reader, it pulls you in right away and makes you start considering, that environment, that microenvironment to some degree as well, of the emergency departments in your local area. And they go through this anecdote about a patient called Sid, and how he goes through care for a chronic lung condition, and comes out and he's still smoking a cigarette, and having a little uh, you know dialogue with the doctor outside. Um, but they put across this really important thought about that later, discussing it, where they say it would be easy simply to attribute the fault to him and cast him aside because tobacco contributes to his disease. But why did Sid get sick on a hot day when the air was full of particulate matter? Whom do we blame on the days when children with asthma or cystic fibrosis who have tenuous lungs are forced to breathe the equivalent of cigarette smoke just because they inhale bad air from the atmosphere around them? And I know a lot of people, I personally know a lot of people who maybe look at that and think that that's blown out of proportion, or it's kind of giving Sid an excuse. But I think that it is very important. I mean, I know there are cities, that are, like LA, Bombay, Delhi, some cities in China that are experiencing horrible, horrible levels of air pollution, and to the degree where it's like smoking maybe a couple packs of cigarettes, um, just by being outside, and that is going to have an eventual impact. And just like with tobacco, it took us maybe 50, 60 years of research and denial and public discussion to realize its actual issues and its actual medical consequences. It might hopefully doesn't take that long for us to realize the consequences of something like this. Um, and as they mentioned in the later as well, that there are two doctors considering something that is more uh, regularly discussed by climate scientists or other types of environmentalists or scientists, and they feel the need to elevate the medical profession to a leadership position when in regards to this topic. And I think that's just obvious even looking at the coronavirus pandemic. Um, we are seeing doctors and nurses take on the task of being on the front line against this disease, and they're they're also falling victim to it. And you see a massive mobilization, whether it's even just staying at home, but like a global effort to protect their profession, and and obviously other uh, uh, you service members like firefighters and stuff like that, but specifically, doctors and nurses and other people working in hospitals, administrators and stuff. And it is important that, as they say, they are doctors on the front line who every day see medical repercussions on human beings of climate change, pollution, and the reduction of biodiversity. Um, and so that right there lays out, I feel, their entire approach, and their reasoning behind the writing of this book. Um, and so another quote in that same context, they said that they're convinced that droughts, floods, hurricanes, toxic waste, forest fires, severe tornadoes, and pollution-filled air make people sick or worse. And it's almost ridiculous. It seems almost like ridiculous to have to read something like that. That seems just so obvious, but we're ignoring it, and I think that when you see it actually written out like that, it makes it more impactful. It gives it more gravity um, than just people just saying it, or you maybe watching a video about it. But to hear that coming from doctors, I think is a really important thing. Um, and then to sum up their entire big picture, again here they reiterate their idea that their intent is to enlighten laypersons about the implications of the environment on their health. But they also mentioned that in writing this book, they've introduced a fusion science um, called Enviromedics, and it's also a newly coined term, as I say. And it is that Enviromedics itself is defined as the impact of environmental change upon human health and its related study. Um, and in that context, it's almost like they also mentioned later that it's almost impossible to neglect the human uh, impact on climate change, and how we're you know, making it worse. And that again takes us right into the intro of the first part of the book, Climate Change Cascade. And here they mention basically environmental change, in particular global warming, has been proclaimed the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. And uh, so starting off climate change, so that takes us into part one, climate change cascade. And they start that off by discussing basically the idea that they are not environmental scientists. And they have a great quote here, like we will continue to formulate our opinions about what might be happening to Earth's environment based upon our interpretation of scientific data and other opinions. However, in order for readers effectively to interpret and apply enviromedics to their thinking, we are required to explain our understanding of what certain environmental scientists claim. Um, what's that? So, part one is called Climate Change Cascade. There's a little intro to it. And in that intro, there's a great quote where they say, as physicians, we understand that serious diseases often progress from one small and unnoticed change in normal human physiology that leads to another change and then another. And that, can be generalized, obviously, to climate change, rhetoric, data, and the discussion surrounding it. We're seeing these little incremental things, we've even tracked many, different metrics that we've tracked over a long period of time, causing this, or correlating strongly with a increase in global temperatures and, on average. Um, and so they discuss four main environmental stressors, which they again reiterate as being rising temperatures, extreme weather events, rising sea levels, and increased atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that's specifically, I guess, to the more like in terms of like our atmosphere and our purely environmental stressors, not considering, I guess, like organisms. So chapter two is called Climate Change 101, a primer. And it starts off with an awesome graphic that basically, you know, clearly demonstrates the purpose of this book. It shows from the center going outwards those four different conditions that they just discussed in the beginning of this section of this part one, and how each one of those then plays into impacts on human health. For example, here you see more extreme weather, creates changes in vector ecology that can lead to increased malaria, dengue, encephalitis, hantavirus, etc. Or how environmental degradation, such as loss of public lands to increasing water levels, can lead to forced migration, civil conflict, and also have mental health impacts. I think that's just an amazing graphic that one should definitely take a look at. And then throughout the chapter, they discuss uh, many different like details regarding these four metrics that they're taking into consideration, or these four parameters. Um, they talk about how carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide concentrations have increased to levels unprecedented over the past 1.2 million years. Um, and they discuss how that type of research occurs by pulling um, ice samples from Greenland, Antarctica, and North America. And I think that makes this section really interesting is they give you a tidbit of data, but then instead of focusing on like the, basically I'd say the pathos of that data, they decide to go straight into the logos of it to some degree and talk about exactly how that, data is formulated or, aggregated. And I thought, that's definitely playing to their purpose here. And then in the second section, in linking climate change and human health, they bring in a new another graphic that basically shows how an increase in the average temperatures can have dramatic impacts in, relative to what we consider to be outlier temperatures or outlier effects. And that this is one of the first times I've seen data like this or a presentation like this discussed so clearly and so effectively. Um, and this quote puts it across so effectively. What appears to be happening with climate change is that the bell-shaped curve that represents weather patterns is both moving to the right, warmer temperatures, and becoming flattened, which means the extreme events are becoming more common. Among these uncommon events, some are far more intense than any in historical memory. And an exploration of data like that is amazing because we're now seeing that happen in our general civic discussion in relation to coronavirus. We've heard a lot about this idea of flattening the curve, and that kind of, obviously this is a more traditional normal distribution, and that more relates to an over time progression of the disease throughout the, or, how it spreads. But even then, it's important that we become used to discussing data and projections like this, and because that is one of the key ways we find correlations between medical and between environmental issues and human health, or even between human behavior or like different habits and their impact on human health as well, is through statistical analysis. And I think that this is a great demonstration of that. And then they go into just how warming of temperatures is going to impact human health in the future. They provide some details, like a study published by researchers at the Harvard School of Public Health clarified that for each 1 degree increase in summer temperatures, the death rates for elders with chronic medical conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, and chronic lung disease increased by an amount of 2.8 to 4%. I think that's, details like that are mind-boggling, especially when we see such a massive reaction to a mortality rate of coronavirus or the flu or anything like that. Now, we're talking about 2.8 to 4% here, increasing that. Obviously, we're not exactly sure of how big of an increase that is, but still, it's not neglectable. Um, and then another really cool, another concept that I've been kind of thinking about myself lately is it is predicted that population growth will be accompanied by rapid urbanization, which will add to cities' thermal storage capacity, resulting in an urban heat island effect. Um, and I've lived in the bigger cities, and I've almost felt that happen over time as the populations have increased, as more cars have come out on the roads. It just seems to be getting warmer, muggier, and I'm sure that can lead to all kinds of, just generally thinking of mold and different types of issues, and structures and stuff that can lead to human health issues. Um, and then they continue to talk about other aspects of the same. But when it comes to extreme weather, they say They note this very specific thing. They say one notion in the scientific field of microbiology views the world as being covered by a fecal veneer, in which our planet is blanketed by layers of infectious filth. And I found that to be again uh, jarring to some degree, but it is definitely a perspective. Like I know there are a lot of different schools of thoughts in biology and stuff, but that's definitely a very interesting, you know, perspective to or lens to see the world through. Um, and it states that public health efforts have focused on keeping this veneer thin where people live, trying to separate humans from sewage and agricultural fields. But that's more, I feel like, efforts being undertaken in, you know, the developed world and the first world countries of the world, and in the developing nations, you still see massive issues. Elections are still won on promises of providing sanitary latrines and you know basic sanitation, sewage. So if we are not able to solve those in a vast majority of the human populace, for a vast majority of the human populace, eventually that will lead to major health crises. Uh, But again, to think of everything like a fecal veneer is or having like a fecal veneer is very interesting. Um, and yeah, they also, they talk about, to wrap it up, about mosquitoes again as being, vector-borne or leading to vector-borne diseases such as malaria and dengue. And they respond to warmer global temperatures because, warmer temperatures lead to greater fertility in mosquitoes, and they actually move more too. They expand their habitats. Um, and that again pretty much wraps it up there. But it's these first few chapters are interesting because they basically set up the language that they'll be using or the vernacular that they've decided to employ in their approach here. And I found it really interesting. I found it very effective, uh, specifically when transitioning between anecdotes and some very serious, you know, facts or statistics. Um, but yeah, let me know what you think, and post your comments down below. And I've also added some links for some things that I found interesting, like the Betty Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So yeah, have a good day, and hope you guys are doing all right out there.